All right, welcome back, everyone, to the Weekend Primetime. We begin this hour with another legal win for the Trump administration's immigration agenda. A federal appeals court on Thursday blocked an earlier ruling that ordered the administration to return control of the troops back to the state. A new hearing is now scheduled for this Tuesday. The decision comes after California Governor Gavin Newsom sued the Trump administration over their deployment of troops in order to quell anti-ICE protests in Los Angeles. President Trump continues to argue that federal intervention is necessary. But in his order, federal Judge Breyer says that in dispatching the troops, Trump both exceeded the scope of his statutory authority and violated the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. And while this legal back and forth continues, ICE raids are still terrifying immigrants and their families in Los Angeles and beyond. Joining us now is Temidayo Aganga-Williams, a former federal prosecutor and senior investigative counsel for the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack. Temidayo, it's great to have you with us. So what do you make of this legal back and forth and whether or not it was at one point a win for California and reclaiming the National Guard, but then again, by the end of the week, the authority was granted to Trump to continue?
Yeah, so starting first with Judge Breyer's decision, what Judge Breyer was considering is whether the president had the authority to federalize the National Guard. Now, the president has permission to do that, but he has to meet certain circumstances, 3 of them. So first, is there an invasion by a foreign power? That was not questioned here. Second, is there a rebellion that is ongoing here? The president said, yes, that was happening. And then third, whether the president was unable to execute federal law, also in dispute here. Judge Breyer, in his, what I thought was a thorough and detailed analysis, says there's not a factual basis to find either of those last 2 categories has happened here. What's also interesting, though, is that he says that he disposes of the president's argument that that very question can be reviewed by judges. President Trump's team says that that is not up to others to decide. He, the president, can decide whether there's a rebellion, whether he's unable to execute the laws, and that's enough. Judge Breyer slaps that down wholeheartedly. And I would not go as far as to say that the appellate court handed a victory to President Trump. What the appellate court said is, let's keep things as they are, the status quo. So it's not so much a victory, but it's a pause. Because then I think that's fair in a decision of this kind of importance, that you want a higher court here, an appellate court, deciding what happens before the ultimate decision is arrived at.
Which would be, I suspect, the Supreme Court. And you have a lot of things that are making their way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Do we have a sense of when all of these constitutional issues that are playing out will get resolved, and if they will get resolved by the Supreme Court? Because when things stay the status quo, the authority stays with the president to continue to do what people like Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles and the governor of California, respectively, are arguing is destroying communities and damaging the Constitution.
Well, when I say a higher court, the appellate court is one of those higher courts. So ultimately, it likely will get to the Supreme Court. But the appellate court that issued the stay is going to hear argument and then ultimately make a determination. And at that point, that court may say there doesn't need to be a pause in status quo. The next question after that is, does the Supreme Court get involved? And then they now say, we want to hear this before it can go forward. But it's common for an appellate court to weigh in and for that to continue. So we may see a resolution here quicker than we think.
Well, so the Supreme Court in the past has been relatively open to the idea of the president and the president alone having a lot more power, right? Having a lot more executive authority. How do these arguments fit into the kinds of jurisprudence that we've seen them be interested in and rule on in recent cases? It sounds like they're likely to take this up.
Yeah. Right?
So what do we know from how they've ruled in the past and how that applies to these particular questions at issue?
So I do think the conservative legal tradition does have a whole lot of deference to the executive. And we see that going all the way back to the Bush era. And so I do think if I'm President Trump and I'm coming to the Supreme Court, I feel pretty confident that they will defer to him on the underlying fact finding, which is really the question here. Was there, in fact, a rebellion happening? From my view, this is all pretextual. There's no evidence of a rebellion. Judge Breyer lays that out in detail. There are not facts to support what the president is asserting. But is the Supreme Court going to get that deep and question and challenge these pretextual reasons? Or is the court going to say the executive, as a commander-in-chief, has the ability and the authority to make those ultimate factual determinations without further oversight? They may.
To put it bluntly, I guess, how afraid are you that we are approaching something scary here. As the executive branch amasses more power, I imagine it's very hard, even years down the line, to reverse that once it's accepted and normalized. I think people are processing still images that they've seen just in the past 7 or so days. We saw a senator tackled to the ground, Senator Alex Padilla. Of course, he's not actually charged with anything, but I think just the fact that someone in that branch of government could be treated that way was alarming to many Americans. And now many, I think, see what's happening out there and as this case progresses as part of a broader pattern of this administration just simply not wanting to have to do what courts ask of them. Where do you think we are?
So I'm a little more pessimistic. I don't think we are approaching a problem. I think we have sprinted and we're running past the problem. I think we're already at that stage. We're not approaching. The question is whether we're going to have the ability to reverse course here. The rule of law is clearly under attack in this country, and the president has no qualms about asserting in legal brief again and again that he answers to no one. What Judge Breyer was pushing back against is that very question. He's telling President Trump, you answer to me. I can step in and tell you whether or not there's been rebellion because I can observe facts as well as you can. So my concern, I think, has been held strongly since January 6th. You want to talk about a rebellion, you want to talk about people rejecting the authority of the government, you should look what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. But President Trump then took no action. He didn't seek to call the National Guard. He didn't seek to intervene. He didn't seek to call the Department of Defense. He did nothing. And when you compare that to what's happening here, when you see massively peaceful protests, when you see citizens exercising their First Amendment rights, and then you see that being the opportunity where the federal government is stepping in to use federal force, that's incredibly disheartening, and I think it's dangerous, and people should take note of that now.
Is Los Angeles a test case?
I think these are all test cases. I do. I think they're all test cases. I think the administration is pushing the bounds of the executive power again and again and again, and the courts are stepping up again and again and again. But if the Supreme Court doesn't step up and the Supreme Court doesn't place some boundaries on this administration, then ultimately this will all be for nothing.
So a lot of these issues that we're talking about are rooted in the objections to what ICE has been doing, right? That they've been ramping up many of their tactics. They're showing up at World Cup parties, working with security guards to bar volunteers and reporters and lawyers, I believe, from court hearings, immigration court hearings. They're taking kids from foster care. And then obviously we've seen all these raids at workplaces and other sites. What legal recourse do those who are targeted actually have in these cases? It's a little bit unclear to me how much of this is legal and how much of this is not legal. And it almost feels like a naive question to be asking that at this point.
So it depends who you're talking about. I think what's really scary is when you have stories of American citizens being detained by ICE, when you have stories of those with status and green cards being detained where there isn't a legal basis for them to be taken into detention. When you're talking about those who may not have status, well, there is a legal basis to detain those individuals, but if we compare how different administrations have handled this, the term discretion is what comes into play. President Biden and President Obama focused on those who had committed violent crimes, those who actually threatened national security. They didn't focus on individuals who were otherwise hardworking, trying to create a life for themselves. This administration currently has been indiscriminate in how it's gone after people, how it's done raids, how it's focused on hardworking people on farms or other labor-intensive jobs. So that discretion is what happens when you have a shift in power.
But they have the legal power to do these things.
They do have the legal power. If you were undocumented, yes, the government has the legal power to enforce the immigration laws. But that's not, I was a prosecutor. You have the power to do a whole lot of things, but you have discretion to decide what is best for the objectives of public safety. And I think that's where judgment comes into place.
Temidayo Agenga-Williams, thank you so much for your insight tonight. We appreciate you.